Erwin Rommel defeated the French in 6 weeks. He drove the British out of Greece and out of Crete. He pushed the Eighth Army back across Libya so fast that for a time it seemed nothing in the desert could stand in his way, and he came close enough to Egypt that the Suez Canal itself felt within reach. But in his private papers, the notes and reflections he kept through years of campaigning, later gathered and published after his death, a different picture emerges. Rommel did not write about the British soldier the way a victorious general writes about a beaten enemy. He wrote about him the way a professional writes about an opponent who kept finding ways to make victory expensive and who never seemed to fully break, no matter how badly a battle had gone against him. The question his papers leave unanswered is why. Why would a commander who outmaneuvered, outflanked, and repeatedly defeated British forces in the field come away from those victories with something closer to respect than contempt? Why would German intelligence assessments, again and again across 5 years of war, single out British infantry for a caution that they did not extend to every army they faced? The answer does not begin with a single battle. It begins with the first moment German commanders discovered that a British unit could be surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered, and would still, somehow, refuse to behave the way a beaten unit was supposed to behave. In May of 1940, as German armor tore through the Low Countries and northern France faster than anyone on the Allied side had planned for, entire divisions were being encircled in days rather than weeks. This was the campaign that was supposed to prove, once and for all, that the old European armies could not withstand the new German way of war. At Paradis, a small position held by the Royal Norfolk Regiment found itself cut off, surrounded, and reduced to a fraction of its strength, with no realistic hope of relief and no path of retreat. By every rational calculation, the position should have surrendered hours before it did. It did not. The Royal Norfolks continued to fight in a battle that cost them heavily long after most military logic said the outcome was already settled. What happened to the survivors afterward was one of the war's early atrocities, but what German commanders took from the engagement itself before that was a specific and uncomfortable observation, that a British unit with no chance of winning would still make the fight cost far more than the numbers suggested it should. That observation repeated itself days later, on a much larger scale, at Dunkirk. The German High Command expected the encircled British Expeditionary Force to collapse, to be captured wholesale, the way large formations elsewhere in the campaign had been. Instead, a rearguard action, fought by units that understood they were buying time rather than fighting for their own survival, held the perimeter long enough for over 300,000 men to be evacuated across the Channel. It was, by any strict military accounting, a defeat. Northern France was lost. The BEF's equipment was left behind on the beaches in staggering quantities. But something else was left behind too, a data point, sitting quietly in German staff assessments, that Rommel and officers like him would carry forward into every campaign that followed. British units, even when losing, even when surrounded, did not fight like men who expected the war to be over. They were wrong to assume it would be. When Rommel arrived in North Africa in early 1941, he came with a reputation for speed and improvisation that had terrified French commanders and unsettled British ones in equal measure. His early campaigns against the British Eighth Army confirmed everything German intelligence believed about mobile warfare: outflank, encircle, force a retreat before the enemy can consolidate. For a while, it worked exactly as intended. Tobruk, however, became the place where Rommel's assumptions about British resilience were tested directly rather than inferred from a retreat. The garrison there, a mixed force that included Australian, British, and other Commonwealth units, was besieged for months, cut off from easy resupply, subjected to repeated German assaults meant to break the position the way so many other positions had broken in the campaigns before it. It did not break. What followed was a siege that dragged on far longer than German planning had allowed for, tying down men and armor that Rommel needed elsewhere, and forcing German commanders to treat besieged and outnumbered as something other than a synonym for finished. He would hold it anyway, the garrison's commanders seemed to have decided, and the German officers facing them began to understand that this decision was not an accident of circumstance. It was becoming a pattern. The desert campaign that followed, across 1941 and into 1942, turned into a back-and-forth of advances and retreats on both sides, Rommel pushing the Eighth Army back toward Egypt, the Eighth Army recovering and pushing him back toward Libya, neither side achieving the clean, decisive breakthrough that the opening months of the war in France had suggested was simply how modern mechanized battles were won. This back-and-forth mattered in a way that a single decisive victory never could have. Each time the campaign reversed direction, German officers were forced to update their understanding of exactly what kind of army they were fighting. An army that could be routed once and dismissed was a manageable problem. An army that kept reappearing, reorganized and resupplied, ready to contest the same ground again within months, was something closer to a permanent feature of the campaign, one that had to be planned around rather than simply defeated and forgotten. Something else was happening in the desert at the same time, away from the main tank battles, something that would matter more to the specific question of what the Germans feared than any single armored engagement. Small British units, formed initially almost informally, began operating behind German lines at night, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could ever take off, striking supply routes far from any front line, and in November of 1941, launching a raid aimed directly at Rommel's own headquarters, a mission timed for the same night as one of the first missions ever carried out by a new unit called the Special Air Service. The raid on Rommel's headquarters did not succeed in its central aim, but its very existence told German commanders something unsettling, that the war in the desert was no longer confined to the daylight hours and the open tank country where German doctrine had every advantage. There was now a second front, operating in darkness, striking without warning, and vanishing back into the desert before any conventional response could be organized. Now consider what that meant for a German officer stationed at a rear airfield or a supply depot hundreds of miles from the nearest visible front line. The war he had trained for was one of maneuver and armor, fought in daylight, between forces he could see forming up against him. The war he was now fighting included an enemy he could not see coming at all. By the autumn of 1942, the Desert War had reached the position at El Alamein, where the Eighth Army, reorganized, reinforced, and commanded now by Bernard Montgomery, prepared for the offensive that would finally break Rommel's grip on the campaign for good. The Second Battle of El Alamein was not a battle of the kind that had defined the war's opening years. It was a grinding, methodical, artillery-heavy assault against prepared German and Italian defensive lines, fought over days rather than settled in a single dramatic maneuver. What German officers observed during that battle and reported afterward in their own assessments was a British infantry force that advanced under fire with a discipline that did not waver even as casualties mounted. The formations kept their shape and kept moving, unit cohesion holding even as the individual soldiers within those units were falling in significant numbers around them. This was, to a professional German officer, the single most important quality an infantry force could demonstrate. Courage under fire is common enough in every army in every war. Discipline that survives sustained losses without the formation itself dissolving into chaos is rarer, and it was exactly the quality that separated a genuinely dangerous enemy from a merely brave one. Rommel's own forces at El Alamein, worn down by supply shortages that had plagued the Afrika Korps for months, were finally forced into the retreat that would end his time as the dominant force in North Africa. But the manner of that defeat, ground down methodically by an enemy that did not break under pressure, reinforced everything his private assessments had already begun to suggest about the army he had spent 2 years fighting. That distinction would define everything that followed for the rest of the war. It is worth pausing here to address a comparison that German officers themselves made, because it complicates the picture in an important way rather than simplifying it. American forces entered the North African campaign in late 1942, and their first major engagements particularly at the Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, did not go well. German commanders who encountered the newly arrived American units found them inexperienced, sometimes poorly coordinated, and prone to the kind of tactical mistakes that seasoned troops had long since learned to avoid. This is where the comparison becomes genuinely interesting, rather than a simple case of one army being feared and another dismissed. The Americans learned faster than anyone expected. Within months of Kasserine, American units in Tunisia were fighting with a coordination and aggression that German officers began describing in strikingly different terms. Not the caution and disciplined German assessments associated with British infantry, but an overwhelming, almost relentless use of firepower and rapid follow-through that some German veterans came to fear in its own distinct way. Where British units were feared for their refusal to break and their methodical persistence, American units came to be feared for the sheer volume of artillery and air power they were willing to bring down on any position that resisted them, and for how quickly they moved to exploit any opening that followed. Here is the comparison, stated plainly. German soldiers did not fear the British and dismiss the Americans. They feared two different things for two different reasons. The British represented an enemy that would not quit no matter the cost to itself. The Americans represented an enemy that would answer any resistance with an amount of firepower that made continued resistance suicidal and would not hesitate to use it. Both reputations were earned through the same underlying quality, a professional culture that translated into battlefield behavior a German officer could rely on, battle after battle, regardless of which specific unit he happened to be facing. That reliability, more than any single tactic or weapon, was what separated an army worth truly worrying about from one that could still be outmaneuvered by confidence alone. The Italian campaign, beginning in 1943, tested this British reputation in some of the worst terrain of the entire war. At Monte Cassino, British and Commonwealth forces, alongside American, Polish, and other Allied troops, fought through months of attritional combat against a heavily fortified German defensive line built around the mountain and its monastery. Every time you dealt with one attack, the next was already being prepared. That was the operational reality German defenders faced throughout the Italian campaign, a persistent, grinding pressure that did not let up even when individual assaults failed, forcing German commanders into a defensive posture that consumed resources and manpower they could not easily replace. Normandy, in the summer of 1944, repeated this pattern on a larger scale. British and Commonwealth forces around Caen fought through weeks of brutal attritional combat against some of the most experienced German divisions in the West, including elements of the same forces that had faced Rommel's former adversaries in the desert years earlier. The fighting around Caen was slow, costly, and did not produce the swift breakthrough that Allied planners had hoped for, but it fixed German armor in place, drew German reserves away from the American sector to the west, and set the conditions for the breakout that followed. German commanders assessing the Normandy fighting afterward described a British operational approach defined by relentless pressure rather than dramatic maneuver, an approach that, however slow it appeared from the outside, never allowed German forces the breathing room to reorganize and counterattack effectively. The cumulative effect of Italy and Normandy together reinforced a conclusion German staff officers had been building toward since Tobruk. This was not an army that needed to win quickly to win at all. It could absorb a stalemate, sustain losses that would have broken the cohesion of a less disciplined force, and simply continue applying pressure until the German position it was attacking no longer had the men or the material to hold. If any single episode captures the paradox at the heart of this story, it is Arnhem. In September of 1944, British paratroopers landed as part of Operation Market Garden with the objective of seizing and holding a bridge deep behind German lines, expecting relief from ground forces within days. That relief did not arrive in time. The men holding the bridge and the surrounding positions found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and facing German armor that should not, by the original plan, have been anywhere near that sector. They held on regardless, for far longer than the situation should have allowed, in a battle that ended in defeat, but produced some of the most widely respected accounts of the entire war regarding the fighting quality of the men involved. Respect that came, notably, from the German officers who fought against them and later described the engagement in their own post-war accounts and interrogations. Months later, in the Reichswald forest along the German border, British and Canadian forces fought through some of the last and most difficult defensive terrain of the war in the west, dense woodland, flooded ground, and prepared German positions manned by some of the last capable formations the Wehrmacht had left to commit. German accounts from that fighting describe an enemy that advanced through appalling conditions with the same grinding persistence that had defined every major engagement since Tobruk. They fought as though each man had made a personal decision that he would not stop until the position was taken, whatever it cost to take it. So we return to the question Rommel's private papers leave unanswered. Why would a commander who defeated British forces repeatedly in campaign after campaign come away from those victories with something closer to respect than contempt? The answer was never one battle. It was a professional culture demonstrated consistently, from the Paradis in 1940 to the Reichswald in early 1945. A discipline that held formations together under fire, a persistence that refused to treat encirclement or heavy losses as a reason to surrender, and in the deserts of North Africa, a willingness to fight a war after dark that German doctrine had never fully prepared for. That fear had a name in the German professional vocabulary, repeated across intelligence assessments, private letters, and post-war interviews with the men who had actually faced it in the field. It was respect.